Good afternoon, everyone. How are you doing today? I hope your day is going well. Today, let me start by telling you something most people don't realize. The most dangerous fat in your body is not the fat you can pinch. It's not the fat you see in the mirror. It's the fat you cannot see at all. It's called visceral fat, and it wraps itself around your liver, your pancreas, your intestines, and your heart. And this fat is not quiet. It is not passive. It behaves like an endocrine organ. Visceral fat releases inflammatory chemicals every single day. It disrupts insulin signaling. It drives fatty liver, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and even cancer. And you can look perfectly normal on the outside while carrying a dangerous amount of it on the inside. That's why some people say, "Doctor, I'm not that overweight, but my labs are terrible." This is why. Now, before I start today's informative lecture, make sure you're subscribed to my YouTube channel. And if you think this can be helpful to any of your family or friends, just share it with them right after you finish watching. Now, here's the most important thing I want you to understand. Visceral fat does not respond to calories the way you think it does. You do not lose visceral fat by eating less and moving more. You lose visceral fat by changing hormones. And the hormone that matters more than any other is insulin. Insulin is the master switch that when insulin is high, visceral fat is protected. When insulin is low, visceral fat becomes vulnerable. This is not opinion. This is physiology. Every time you eat, insulin rises. That's normal. But when you eat constantly, breakfast, snacks, lunch, snacks, dinner, dessert, insulin never gets a chance to come down. And when insulin stays elevated, fat-burning pathways shut off completely. In that state, visceral fat is locked away. Your body cannot access it. Even if you're exercising, even if you're eating healthy, even if you're restricting calories, this is why people feel like they're doing everything right and still getting nowhere. Visceral fat survives because insulin is constantly telling the body store, protect, preserve. So the real question is not how do I burn fat? The real question is how do I lower insulin long enough for fat burning to begin? And this is where fasting comes in, not as a diet, not as deprivation, but as a biological tool. Fasting is simply the absence of eating long enough for insulin to fall. And when insulin falls, a remarkable shift happens inside the body. The protection around visceral fat is removed. Enzymes that were locked shut suddenly open. Fat cells release stored energy. The liver switches from storage mode into export mode. Growth hormone rises. Inflammation begins to quiet down. Visceral fat becomes fuel. And here's the key point that most people miss. The body does not burn visceral fat randomly. It burns it first because from a survival standpoint, visceral fat is dangerous. Once insulin drops and the body feels safe enough to burn fat, it targets the fat that causes the most harm. But this only happens when insulin stays low long enough. If you're still here listening to me, comment below the word yes, and I'll know how many of you are serious about this informative lecture. Now, I'll explain why constant eating keeps insulin elevated around the clock, how this traps visceral fat even in people who are fasting on paper, and why one specific fasting strategy makes visceral fat almost impossible to defend. Most people today are eating in a way their biology was never designed for. We wake up and eat early, we snack through the day, we eat late at night, and then we repeat this pattern every single day. From the body's perspective, this means one thing. Insulin is almost never low. Insulin is not just a blood sugar hormone. Insulin is a storage hormone. When insulin is elevated, your body is being told that food is plentiful and energy needs to be stored. And when that signal never shuts off, fat-burning pathways never turn on. This is especially true for visceral fat. Visceral fat cells are highly sensitive to insulin. They are loaded with insulin receptors. That means even modest insulin elevations are enough to keep visceral fat locked away. So when someone tells me, "Doctor, I only eat healthy foods," you see, my next question is always, how often are you eating? Because frequency matters more than content when it comes to insulin. You can eat clean food all day long and still keep insulin elevated from morning to night. And if insulin stays elevated, visceral fat remains protected. This is why calorie restriction alone fails. You can reduce calories and still eat frequently. The scale may move a little. You may lose some superficial fat, but visceral fat often remains unchanged because insulin never drops low enough for long enough. This is also why people plateau. They start a diet, they lose some weight, then everything stops, and they blame their metabolism, their age, or their genetics. But the real issue is hormonal. Insulin is still elevated too often. Now, here's something important that I want to be very clear about. Fasting is not magic. Fasting works because it creates time. Time without insulin, time for the body to switch fuel sources, time for growth hormone to rise, time for fat burning enzymes to activate. When insulin finally falls and stays low, the body shifts into a completely different metabolic state. Glycogen stores are depleted, fat becomes the primary fuel, and visceral fat, which is metabolically active and dangerous, becomes a prime target. This is not starvation, this is metabolic flexibility. Starvation happens when nutrients are absent and the body cannot access stored energy. Fasting is the opposite. Fasting allows the body to access stored energy efficiently, and visceral fat, because of its location and inflammatory nature, is one of the first reserves the body wants to get rid of once insulin allows it. But here's where many people go wrong. They fast inconsistently, they skip breakfast one day, eat late the next, they snack during their fast, they drink sweetened beverages or creamers that keep insulin elevated without realizing it. From the body's perspective, insulin never truly drops, so visceral fat survives. Comment below insulin if you want me to cover more topics on insulin resistance. And if you're enjoying the information so far, make sure you hit that subscribe button and leave me a like on this video. Now, I want to show you the single fasting strategy that consistently lowers insulin in a way that aligns with human circadian biology, protects muscle, and makes visceral fat the first fuel source without extreme fasting or suffering. It's not prolonged fasting. It's not starving for days. And it's not about pushing your body into exhaustion. It's something much simpler and much more powerful. It's early time-restricted eating. This means you stop eating earlier in the evening and allow the overnight fast to do the work it was designed to do. Why is this so important? Because your metabolism follows a circadian rhythm. Your hormones follow a clock, and insulin sensitivity is highest earlier in the day and lowest at night. When you eat late into the evening, insulin stays elevated at a time when the body is supposed to be repairing, cleaning, and burning fat. Instead, it is forced into storage mode at exactly the wrong time. This is where visceral fat thrives. Late eating keeps insulin elevated overnight. It suppresses growth hormone. It disrupts sleep, and it locks visceral fat in place. But when you stop eating earlier, say finishing dinner by 6 or 7 on PM, everything changes. Insulin falls earlier and stays low longer. During the night, growth hormone rises. Growth hormone is a powerful fat-mobilizing hormone. It protects muscle, supports tissue repair, and pulls energy from fat stores, especially visceral fat. While you're sleeping, your liver begins exporting fat instead of storing it. Fatty liver improves, inflammation markers drop, insulin sensitivity begins to reset, and this happens without effort. This is not about willpower, this is about timing. Early time-restricted eating gives you a long, uninterrupted window of low insulin without stressing the body. The overnight fast becomes a metabolic repair phase rather than a survival state. This is why people often tell me, "Doctor, I didn't change what I ate, but my belly started shrinking." That's because visceral fat responds to hormonal signals, not calorie math. Another important point is that visceral fat is highly sensitive to growth hormone and catecholamines. These hormones rise naturally during fasting and sleep when insulin is low, but insulin blocks their effects. So if insulin stays elevated from late meals or frequent snacking, those fat-burning signals are muted. Visceral fat survives. Remove insulin's protection, and visceral fat is exposed. This is also why early time-restricted eating feels easier than other approaches. Hunger hormones adapt. Brain learns the new rhythm. Appetite becomes quieter instead of louder. Your body begins to expect food during a certain window and stops demanding it constantly. And that's when fasting starts working with you instead of against you. Now, let me be clear. This is not about skipping meals randomly. It's not about undereating. It's about creating a predictable rhythm where insulin rises during a feeding window and stays low long enough for repair to occur. That rhythm is what visceral fat cannot survive. If you're still here listening to me, comment below the word listening, and I'll know how many of you are still here with me. Also, if you're enjoying the information so far, make sure you hit that subscribe button and leave me a like on this video. Now, I'll explain what actually happens inside the liver, the muscles, and the fat tissue when insulin stays low overnight, and why visceral fat is the first to be burned while muscle is protected. Because this is where people start to realize that fasting is not weight loss, it's metabolic repair. When you stop eating early and insulin falls, the liver is the first organ to respond. During the day, with frequent eating, the liver is in storage mode. It takes incoming glucose and turns it into fat. That fat accumulates inside liver cells, leading to fatty liver, insulin resistance, and inflammation. But when insulin stays low overnight, the liver switches roles. Instead of storing fat, it starts exporting it. Fatty acids are released and sent into circulation to be used as fuel. This is one of the earliest and most important steps in visceral fat reduction. As liver fat decreases, insulin sensitivity improves. And when the liver becomes insulin sensitive again, the entire metabolic system starts to reset. This is why people often see improvements in triglycerides, fasting insulin, and liver enzymes before they see dramatic changes on the scale. At the same time, muscle tissue becomes more metabolically flexible. In a low insulin state, muscles learn to use fat and ketones more efficiently. This spares glucose and protects muscle mass. Growth hormone, which rises during fasting and sleep, reinforces this effect. It tells the body preserve muscle, burn fat. This is why proper fasting does not cause muscle loss. Muscle loss happens in starvation when insulin is low, but energy cannot be accessed. In fasting, energy is abundant because fat stores are unlocked. Now, let's talk about visceral fat specifically. Visceral fat is different from subcutaneous fat. It is more metabolically active, more inflammatory, and more dangerous. And because of that, it is more sensitive to hormonal changes. When insulin drops, visceral fat cells release free fatty acids more readily than subcutaneous fat. These fatty acids are sent directly to the liver through the portal circulation. This is one reason visceral fat is so harmful when insulin is high, but so responsive when insulin is low. As visceral fat shrinks, inflammatory signaling decreases. Markers like CRP, interleukin 6, and TNF alpha begin to fall. This reduces stress on blood vessels, improves endothelial function, and lowers cardiovascular risk. This is not cosmetic fat loss. This is internal healing. Another important shift happens at the level of leptin and adapton. Visceral fat disrupts leptin signaling, which drives hunger and metabolic slowdown. As visceral fat decreases, leptin sensitivity improves. Appetite becomes more regulated. Energy expenditure stabilizes. Adiponectin, a hormone that improves insulin sensitivity and reduces inflammation, rises as visceral fat falls. This creates a positive feedback loop where metabolism continues to improve. And all of this begins with one thing: low insulin for a sustained period. That is why early time-restricted eating is so powerful. It gives the body enough uninterrupted time to complete these processes without stress. Now, I want to address a common fear people have that fasting will slow metabolism or increase stress hormones, and explain why the opposite is true. When fasting is aligned with circadian biology, you'll slow your metabolism, you'll raise cortisol, you'll stress your body. These common fears come from confusing fasting with starvation. Two very different physiological states. Starvation happens when energy is unavailable. Fasting happens when energy is available, but insulin is low enough to access it. And circadian aligned fasting changes how stress hormones behave in a very important way. Cortisol follows a natural daily rhythm. It is supposed to rise in the morning to help you wake up and mobilize energy, and fall at night so your body can repair and regenerate. Late night eating disrupts this rhythm. When you eat late, insulin stays elevated at a time when cortisol should be declining. This creates hormonal confusion. The body receives mixed signals: store energy and stay alert at the same time. The result is poor sleep, elevated nighttime cortisol, and impaired fat loss. Early time restricted eating fixes this. By finishing your last meal earlier, insulin drops in the evening. This allows cortisol to fall naturally at night. Sleep quality improves. Growth hormone rises. Repair processes turn on. And here's the key point most people miss: fasting does not increase cortisol when the body can access fat. In fact, cortisol often decreases over time because the body is no longer under constant metabolic stress from high insulin and unstable blood sugar. Blood glucose becomes more stable, adrenal demand drops, the nervous system shifts toward parasympathetic dominance. This is why many people report feeling calmer, not more stressed once their body adapts. Now, let's talk about metabolism. Metabolic slowdown occurs when the body senses energy scarcity and cannot access stored fuel. This happens with chronic calorie restriction, crash dieting, and constant grazing combined with low calories. Fasting is different. When insulin is low, fat stores are unlocked. The body has access to tens of thousands of calories. There is no signal of scarcity. Studies consistently show that short-term fasting increases norepinephrine, which raises metabolic rate. Resting energy expenditure does not fall. In some cases, it increases. Growth hormone rises sharply during fasting and sleep. This protects lean tissue and supports fat mobilization. Thyroid signaling remains stable when fasting is not combined with chronic undereating. This is why people can fast and still maintain strength, body temperature, and mental clarity. Now let's address a critical mistake. Skipping breakfast while still eating late at night is not the same as early time restricted eating. That pattern creates prolonged stress because insulin stays elevated late. Sleep quality suffers and the fasting window occurs during the wrong part of the circadian cycle. The body interprets that as misalignment, not optimization. The power comes from ending food intake early, not delaying the first meal at all costs. This is why many people feel better eating breakfast and lunch than stopping early rather than skipping breakfast and eating dinner late. Circadian alignment matters more than fasting duration, and when fasting is aligned with your internal clock, the body responds with improved insulin sensitivity, better hormone balance, and sustainable fat loss without metabolic damage. If you're enjoying the information so far, make sure you hit that subscribe button and leave me a like on this video, and also share it with your loved ones for whom you care about. Now let's turn all of this physiology into something practical without turning it into a diet, a challenge, or another rule-based system that collapses after a few weeks. The goal is not to fast longer, the goal is to fast consistently and in alignment with biology. The core strategy is simple. Early time-restricted eating done the same way most days of the week. That means you choose a daily eating window that starts earlier in the day and ends earlier in the evening, ideally before your body begins its nighttime repair phase. For most people, this looks like eating between roughly 8:00 a.m. and 4:00 p.m. or 9:00 a.m. and 5:00 p.m. The exact hours matter less than the pattern. What matters is that insulin has time to fall in the evening and remain low through the night. This overnight low insulin period is where visceral fat becomes vulnerable. During the first several hours after your last meal, your body finishes processing glucose and stored glycogen. Insulin continues to decline. Once liver glycogen drops, the body shifts into fat-dominant metabolism. Visceral fat, because of its location and high insulin sensitivity, is accessed early. This is not willpower. This is sequence. Now, here's an important clarification. Early time-restricted eating does not mean undereating. You still eat real meals. You still consume adequate protein, fats, and micronutrients. You just consume them in a window that works with your hormones instead of against them. Protein earlier in the day improves insulin sensitivity and preserves lean mass. Healthy fats slow digestion and stabilize blood sugar. Whole foods reduce the insulin spike compared to ultra-processed meals. And because insulin sensitivity is highest earlier in the day, the same meal produces a smaller insulin response than it would at night. This means less insulin exposure overall without changing calories. That's why people often lose visceral fat while eating the same or even more food. Now let's talk about adaptation. The first 7-14 days are not about fat loss. They're about metabolic transition. Your body is learning to switch between fuel sources again. Hunger hormones like green reset to your new eating times. Insulin receptors begin to re-sensitize. During this phase, mild hunger waves are normal, but they are temporary and rhythmic, not constant. They rise and fall like a signal, not an emergency. Hydration, electrolytes, and adequate protein make this transition smoother. Sleep becomes deeper. Morning energy improves. Cravings begin to quiet. And here's a key mental shift. You are not skipping meals. You are closing your eating window. That framing matters because the body responds to patterns, not deprivation. Once the rhythm is established, visceral fat loss becomes a background process, not something you have to force. Now, one more crucial point. You do not need to do this perfectly. Even 5 days per week of consistent early eating can dramatically lower insulin exposure over time. Social flexibility does not erase the signal as long as the pattern returns. This is how metabolic health is restored, not through intensity, but through repetition. At this point, the story of visceral fat should look very different to you. It's not stubborn, it's not personal, and it's not a failure of effort. Visceral fat is a response. It exists because your internal environment has been signaling one thing over and over again. Energy is always coming in, insulin is always high, and storage is safer than release. When that signal changes, visceral fat has no reason to stay. That's the part most people never hear. The body does not cling to visceral fat out of spite. It holds on to it because hormones tell it to. And the moment insulin exposure is reduced in a consistent rhythmic way, that protection disappears. Fasting, specifically early time restricted fasting, is not a hack because it's extreme. It's a hack because it restores order. Low insulin at night allows growth hormone to rise. Growth hormone is not a muscle building hormone in adults. It's a repair and fat mobilizing hormone. It pulls energy from internal stores, especially visceral fat, while protecting lean tissue. At the same time, mitochondrial function improves. Cells regain the ability to switch between glucose and fat. Inflammation markers fall. Liver fat begins to clear. Insulin sensitivity improves further, creating a positive feedback loop. This is what metabolic flexibility looks like. And when metabolic flexibility returns, visceral fat becomes metabolically expensive to keep. So the body lets it go. Notice what's missing here. There's no mention of grinding harder. There's no obsession with calories. There's no punishment for eating the wrong food. Instead, there's timing, there's rhythm, there's physiology. This is why so many people feel calmer when they stop eating late. Sleep improves, morning anxiety fades, energy stabilizes. These are not side effects. They are signs that the nervous system and hormones are syncing again. And once the nervous system feels safe, fat loss becomes permissive instead of resistant. That's the deeper truth. Visceral fat loss is not about forcing change. It's about removing interference. When insulin is constantly elevated, fat-burning pathways are blocked. When insulin is allowed to fall, those pathways reopen automatically. Fasting doesn't burn fat. It allows fat burning. And early time-restricted eating does something even more powerful. It aligns that permission with your circadian biology, making visceral fat the first place the body looks for fuel. So if you take nothing else from this video, remember this: you don't need to eat less forever. You don't need to fast longer and longer. You don't need to suffer. You need to give your body predictable periods without food so insulin can fall, repair can happen, and internal fat can finally be accessed. That's not dieting, that's design. And when you work with that design instead of against it, visceral fat doesn't need to be chased. It disappears because it's no longer needed. That's how dangerous internal fat is eliminated, not through effort, but through restored rhythm. And once that rhythm is back, the body does what it has always known how to do. If you've watched my full lecture today, go right now in the comment section and tell me what was the one best thing you learned today. I'd love to hear that. And if you think today's lecture was beneficial and informative, please make sure you subscribe to my channel, hit that like button, and share it with someone you care about. Don't be shy and send it right now. Thanks for joining me in today's session. I really appreciate your attention and love towards my lectures.